Yeah, on.
Two twins.
Hallo. 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 Hallo, wie geht's? Hallo, wie geht's, Nubs?
You got to say it right.
Hello. Hello. You're not answering the question properly. Hallo, wie geht's?
God, I wish I could say it in German. I wish I could say.
You're supposed to say gut.
Gut.
Because I'm
Gut.
saying hello, how are you? And you say gut.
Gut.
Well, welcome to Two Twins in an Album. We certainly hope this is a gut episode today.
Are we doing the episode in English or in German?
I think we better do it in English because I just gave you all the German that I know. Although I must say, I think I know how to count to 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Was it Zen or something? Zen? And the only reason I know that is because we had, in our high school, we had only French or German. We didn't even have Spanish. It was kind of weird. So you were kind of one or the other. Now I was a French guy. I did a lot of Frenching.
Yes.
During those years. I actually studied abroad in France, so I know French pretty well. The extent of my German is what my buddies who went the German track taught me, which was pretty much what you just heard, counting to 10, which I'm actually shocked I still remembered how to do. I don't use my German a lot,
I think, you've never been to Germany, have you?
I haven't. I've always wanted to go. You have now, correct?
Yeah. We did a 12-day trip there in 2017, which right now, during the pandemic, you're like cherishing every international trip you ever took. It's like, are we ever going to get to do this again? But it was sort of I don't know. I think makes it a little weird when everyone talks about like their life goals and, I want to do this and I travel here. But it was definitely a thing where going to Germany was a really important check the box, right? You travel there and you just never get sick of hearing the German language.
Ah, yeah.
It's just phonetically, it's such a interesting language to listen to. Even when people in Germany speak English, it just sounds cool,
Yeah.
It's got that little accent to it. But,
What cities were you in?
So it was a pretty cool trip. Actually, the funniest part of the trip, T, is the group was Mrs. Nubs, me, and my father-in-law. And that
just the three of you?
Yes, that's it. That was the crew. And my father-in-law is this amazing dude, he's just super lovable. And he actually was stationed in Germany when he was in the service. And so going back there, he's been back frequently, but he loves Germany. I mean, it's like his second home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he really knows the area. And so he put together this like perfect trip. We started in Munich and we spent a few days there. And then Salzburg, Austria is literally like on the edge of Germany. And so we did like a 2-hour drive there. And Salzburg is an insanely cool city.
Sounds a little bit like the Griswolds.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit Griswold. It's like European Vacation minus, Audrey and
underrated, by the way, European Vacation.
I think it's the best of the lot.
Do you? Yeah, I think it's really good.
I love it. So then we did Salzburg, Austria, which, birthplace of Mozart and all that history. And then we flew from Salzburg to Berlin and we did 4 days there. And that was the holy grail for me. That was, it's like, I'm not going all the way there and not spending significant time in Berlin. And we're glad we did. So
did you say Ich einen Berliner?
Yeah. Also known as I am a donut.
I'm a jelly donut. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Like the country is as cool as people say it is. A lot of times people travel internationally, they get very impressionable. And, it's so amazing. I mean, it is just a ridiculously neat place.
Yeah, that's great. And did the Griswolds during this trip by any chance stop at Dusseldorf?
We did not go to Dusseldorf. Dusseldorf is in, I think, the northwest part of Germany. And we spent most of our time south, which is Munich, and northeast, which is Berlin, if I have that right.
Well, Dusseldorf is the home of Kling Klang Recording Studio, and really the whole Kling Klang operation, and that will work into tonight's episode 21, where we will discuss the undisputed innovators and pioneers of electronic music. I think we can agree there, right?
I think in terms of what we know as it today, no doubt about it. If you really go deep, you can find some things that are really unconventional and avant-garde. But yes, in terms of like how to turn electronics into pop music, it's Kraftwerk all the way.
Well, listen, Nubs, few people go as deep as you do. I think we can all agree on that. Let's see how deep you go as we go round and round. Nubs, what you been listening to, Buckaroo?
You know, I've got just happen to have three debut albums. The first is a 1970 album called Electronic Meditation by Tangerine Dream, certainly known as one of the other pioneers of electronic music. And this is the debut album. It's a lot of noise. It's not the most comfortable listen, but very, very influential. Next would be Can's debut Monster Movie, the 1969 effort from the very original lineup of Can. It sort of introduced the world to, this thing that would become known as Krautrock, which actually is sort of a demeaning term in Germany. You don't want to say that term in Germany. I made that mistake. But Monster Movie is a classic debut album from Can, and always interesting to check out whatever they're up to. And next, in reissue, it became known as Cluster 71, but it's actually just called Cluster, the debut album by that electronic duo, Dieter Mobius and Hans Joachim Rodelius. And this one also included Connie Plank, who's a key figure in the history of German electronic music as well.
Now, that's just a shameless theme. I mean, now you're not even trying to disguise your round and round theme anymore.
No, there's no mask. There's no mask on this theme. It's as explicit as it gets.
That was right in the face, right in the face.
When last week, when you said we're doing the Man Machine, I was like, okay, I'm just going to do a full dive into my German collection here and make it count.
Just going to hit you over the head with it. Nothing wrong with that at all. Nubs, I've got a band that certainly I think I mentioned on Round and Round a few episodes ago that has popped back up heavily on the radar, not just for me, but probably for many, with their first studio album in over 20 years. But this is the band Hum. And, their most recent album, Inlet, is incredibly good. And, I knew their other record, which was You'd Prefer an Astronaut, pretty well. Downward is Heavenward is one that I really didn't properly, I would say, take the time to dive into and understand. Hum kind of broke up, and it was sort of like, all right, well, I guess we'll just all kind of move along together here. But being able to revisit Downward is Heavenward, which many consider a classic within that sort of spacey emo, there's a lot of ways that you could sort of describe the band Hum. But Downward is Heavenward is a very important piece of their very small catalog. And so I wouldn't say I'm completely dialed into it yet to the point where I have a really sound take on the thing, but really enjoying revisiting it. And I am starting to get it.
It has one of the great 1-2 punches to open it. It opens with a song called Isle of the Cheetah, which is this sort of epic Hum, spacey thing. And then the second track is called Coming Home. I think it's like 2.5 minutes long. It's really short and just a complete jam. Many a night in the late 90s driving around with Coming Home blasting out of the speakers. So it's a very heralded album for sure.
It is. And it also led to me revisiting a great YouTube piece. Hum went on the Howard Stern show back in, I guess it would have been 94.
Well, 95? The album was 95. I don't know what year that was, but it was right around there. Yeah.
So right around the time that Stars was really, and my understanding is that K-Rock in LA and K-Rock in New York, both had a lot to do with the growth of that song and the introduction of that song as a single. And Howard Stern loved it and had the band on. And it was a band that was like not necessarily prepared nor terribly comfortable being on that program, but realized that, he had, 800 million listeners and that it would be a great way to get their song out there. But it's a fun watch. It's like, it's kind of clunky and they had all kinds of technical issues, and it's kind of a good thing to revisit. The second is a record also from this kind of early 90s time period by Lenny Kravitz. And this is Are You Gonna Go My Way? And I think it's, I'm not sure of the exact way to term this, but it's one of the most notable peaking too early records that I can ever think of, because Are You Gonna Go My Way is just an iconic song from the 90s. And then Believe is a brilliant, beautiful song. And you get two songs into it and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be the best record ever created. And then it just sucks, like there are a couple of good moments. I mean, Is There Any Love in Your Heart's pretty good.
I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah. And it definitely rebounds a little bit, but man, it's one of those records where you get through the first two and you think that you're listening to a classic, and then it just sort of doesn't go anywhere. And I recently wanted to listen to it to verify that. And I kind of verified it once again, I must say. Sometimes you revisit those things and it's like, I had that one wrong, but I don't know. I don't know if you agree, but I think I kind of had that one right, actually.
I think it's a great call, actually. First of all, Lenny never really mastered the album. Like,
it's true. Even Mama Said was pretty kind of tailed off.
The first half of Mama Said is like unfairly excellent. And then the second half, it's like, sounds like a mess.
Yeah.
So yeah, Are You Gonna Go My Way held such promise after those. Again, we talked about with the Hum album, a 1-2 punch, as good as anything. But yeah, the rest of Is There Any Love in Your Heart that's a fantastic song.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there's nothing else that stands out. And it does sort of get into this groove of like, just sort of nostalgic slop. There's just nothing too dynamic in it.
Yeah.
Aside from that opening and one track later. So yeah, it's a good call, actually. Yeah.
Well, I liked his 5 album, which was a little bit more electronic. It had some, I mean, again, to your point, top to bottom, it wasn't great, but it definitely had some good moments. But Flying V, Dreadlocks, Lenny, which we were fortunate enough to be able to see. In fact, he opened the show with Is There Any Love in Your Heart, which was great. But we were able to kind of see him during that heyday, which was great. And then the third is certainly an album that top to bottom is quite good. And that is an album called Ferment. And that is by a band called the Catherine Wheel. I think I mentioned them previously during What's in Your Head, but Ferment was the band's first album. And it's really incredible. I mean, from the standpoint of kind of this shoegazy, spacey style, it was a little bit of My Bloody Valentine mixed with a little bit of basic British pop rock. And if you sort of meld those together, Catherine Wheel in their heyday were incredible. Their first 2 albums, I would put those against the first 2 albums of basically any band. I mean, those are outstanding. Now, after that, of course, they started to mess around a little too much with production and I think tried to get a little too cute, but the raw, space shoegaze power of those first 2 records is really special. So if you've yet to check out the Catherine Wheel, please do. And certainly if you've yet to check out Kraftwerk, which I think there will be plenty of people tuning into this that probably haven't. I'd be interested to know who's actually heard of the group versus who has heard some of their stuff versus who really knows their catalog. And, we think it's a very important group to highlight. We will be talking about their album, The Man Machine, today. And certainly looking forward to it. So why don't we, without any further ado, dig into those nerdy deets. Done dirt cheap. Yeah.
You want some dirty deeds? Yeah. You want some dirty deeds?
The Man Machine, or shall I say, Die Mensch Machine.
Yes.
How was my accent? Was it great?
Terrible. Terrible.
Was released on May 19th, 1978. This was Kraftwerk's 7th album. on the aforementioned Kling Klang Records, which was sort of this, studio and record label, kind of this whole Kraftwerk operation that got built out sort of under the umbrella of EMI, where the group originally started. And they kind of were able to build almost their own little version of Apple, where it was sort of designed not just to record, but to create. And obviously with Kraftwerk's experimentation and instrumentation uniqueness when it comes to synthesizers and machines and also some raw instruments, which you started to see less of as the group went on, but certainly early on was still, using analog instruments was something even on the Autobahn record, that you heard the band do a lot. So a lot of fun stuff going on over there at Kling Klang.
Kling Klang, yeah, you're right. It's like Apple, except not an unmitigated financial disaster.
Yeah, exactly. They actually sort of made it work, right?
Yeah.
The record was produced by Rolf and Florian from the band. We'll dig into the I guess the band members, although it's really just two guys that I think are primarily the voice, if you will, of Kraftwerk, but it was produced by those two guys, the co-founders of the group. And, I think what really gets, respected and renowned about this album and every Kraftwerk, it was quite difficult actually trying to pick what the correct Kraftwerk album to do an episode on is, because everyone is sort of unique in its own way. I think what defines the Man Machine beyond anything else is it was basically the entrance into synth pop. There was a lot of krautrock happening, like we went through in your, round and round. There was disco, certainly electronic music and electronic dance music wasn't a foreign idea at this point, but a true synthesizer only pop effort was kind of not a thing yet, nor was this new wave electropop movement that eventually kind of spawned in many ways from this album. So this post-disco new wave really wasn't a thing. And many people credit this album for, setting that up. It was Kraftwerk getting to be much less minimalistic and much less sort of, I guess, artsy and avant-garde, if you will, than some of their previous work. Although, there was good variety to their previous work. If you sort of backtrack, Trans-Europe Express was the album that preceded The Man Machine, which was very minimalist and kind of their first, I would say, foray into melody. You really started to see shorter, more melodic songs, more so than more of a krautrock approach that you had seen in some of their earlier work. It was a pop album, right? And I think The Man Machine in some ways, although a bit tighter than Trans-Europe Express was, is a little bit of a continuation on some of those musical approaches. Radioactivity was before that, and that was their first album that was entirely electronic. And this was a concept album. And then Autobahn was the one before that. This is sort of their classic, many credit this as the first true, I guess EDM, electronic music, this idea of sort of techno, repetitive electronics, sort of the formal way to say it. Most people credit, Autobahn, particularly the long piece title track there. That album was mostly instrumental with the exception of some vocoder stuff and some vocal elements, but for the most part, instrumental.
Do you own or have you ever checked out the albums that preceded Autobahn?
So I was just going to say, I wasn't planning to talk a lot about those just because those are, it seems like those are the ones that really came before the development of their signature sound. Those are certainly more instrumentation driven. They're really interesting. I mean, if you're going to study Kraftwerk, it's an important piece of the story, but you're not so much getting that more signature, innovative Kraftwerk sound. But what do you think of the first three records there?
They're really important. When you look at, get a little German soapbox here, but when you look at the beginnings of German music, it's so important to remember that this is like the early 1970s. And this is like very much post-war, right? And not that far removed from Germany, experiencing and going through one of the darkest times in human history. And this time is not that far removed from National Socialism and all the things that, led to World War II and came out of World War II. And Germany post-war was a disaster zone. Cities were in ruins, just, a tiny bit of history, but like the post-war agreements and sanctions on Germany were intense. I mean, Germany was basically in a place where they had to rebuild from scratch and didn't have a whole lot of resources to do that. So the early German modern music is some of the artists that I mentioned during the Round and Round. These were not like musicians. They didn't have chops. They weren't like American kids sort of picking up guitars and jangling away and writing songs that the girls would scream about. This was like a full rebuilding of a culture, not just a music, but a culture. Most of the popular music at the time was like German Schlager music, which was like, pop music that you might see on TV. So these guys were all more experimenters than they were musicians. And those first few Kraftwerk albums just represent guys literally learning how to use machines. They weren't creating songs. It was not, made for radio. Take one listen to it, you'll know what I mean. But they're really important records to see how these early German artists, and it wasn't just Kraftwerk, it was a whole variety of people, were sort of discovering this new way. And in Germany in the early 1970s, everyone was looking for something new because of all the darkness that they had just been through as a country and as a culture. Those early albums it's like hearing these guys shape something from scratch. And then by the time you get to Autobahn, there actually is something happening there. By the time you get to the Man Machine and Computer World, it's kind of polished and ready for the masses, So yeah, those early albums are worth getting into. It's not the feel good hit of the summer now. You're not going to like listen to it and thoroughly enjoy it, but you're going to probably appreciate it because of what they were trying to discover at the time and how that connects to the musical culture and just the cultural landscape of Germany at this time.
Yeah, it's a little funny to when people refer to Kraftwerk as a dance band, because I mean, as we've mentioned before on the old podcast here, you and I are very busy dancers. I mean, we're very good at it, very skilled in that area.
Yes.
I don't think I could really imagine like dancing it up to Kraftwerk, but it's kind of funny if you look back, they made some appearances on like the Midnight Special, and I think they were on American Bandstand maybe, and in some other sort of television appearances, and you can see people like kind of trying to dance along to it, and it always comes across kind of funny. Actually, I don't think they necessarily wanted people dancing to their music. It was more of an art piece, But yeah, it's always kind of funny to think of this genre that they really pioneered, but I don't really necessarily think that their music was intended for that in the first place.
Well, I will tell you, just in my conversation with Ralph, which I'm sure we'll get to in the Wonder Stories, it is important to note, though, Kraftwerk was heavily influenced and fascinated by dance music. Now, not necessarily early on in the era we're talking about, but as they went on, Detroit techno was a huge deal to them. And it's one of the things we talked about in the interview I did with them. I do think they see themselves as part of that, but it's in this very icy German way, right?
Well, they were certainly part of it. I just, dancing to Kraftwerk, I don't know, maybe it happens. Maybe it's a thing.
If you dance like, you remember Sprockets on Saturday Night Live? If you dance like Dieter from Sprockets, Kraftwerk is perfect.
Right. Because now is the time on Sprockets when we dance.
That's right. Exactly.
Well, the Man Machine, interestingly, was a pretty slow mover commercially. It was initially quite unsuccessful in the UK, which is interesting because it probably was the most commercial sounding effort that they had put forth. So it almost seems like it took Kraftwerk fans a little bit of time to sort of get used to it. But interestingly enough, 4 years later, it reached number 9 on the UK charts and became their second highest charting album besides Autobahn. So, a late bloomer, one that took literally a few years, to find its way up the charts, but eventually did. Its first pressing, you're the vinyl expert here. You'll have to let me know if this is unique or if this was common, but the first pressing was on red vinyl back in 1978. Was that common?
No, that was very unique. Yeah, very unique. That would have been something that was real novelty. I think that was the German release, right? Because the U.S. release
had to be
was on Capitol. That was Kraftwerk's U.S. label.
Yeah,
I think the original German release was on red vinyl. Yeah, that would have been different. And I know too that with the slow moving aspect of this album, a huge part of that was the model was released as a single years later. It was re-released. I think it was maybe 2 years later, maybe even 3.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what gave it kind of its commercial in, and then it became more beloved.
Exactly. And speaking of red, the cover art of this is pretty iconic and pretty interesting. The group pose of the 4 guys. And the background of this, it actually says on the cover, inspired by L. Lisztsky, who is the very famous, very influential Russian, I guess, avant-garde artist that sort of came up with this genre called suprematism, which was this sort of uniformed, geometric, often 3-dimensional, very vivid color treatments, not surprisingly, often red. And Lisztsky also helped with a little propaganda, some propaganda art projects within his
of course.
Not surprisingly, most talented people were sort of looped into that project at this time. But they were obviously very, these guys were certainly artists from the standpoint of some of the themes they were trying to get across in their music and in their approach, and obviously very influenced by a lot of this. I think their music and their approach is very uniformed, and a lot of their themes hit on that. So not terribly surprising that was an artist and an art form that influenced them enough to kind of utilize that approach on the cover to this. And there are a lot of themes around, almost kind of science fiction stuff related to, machines and robots and, kind of foreshadowing a lot of things that have been taking place very much so here, 50-ish years later, as well as some themes around kind of urbanization and glamour and some of these things that really hold up extremely well. I mean, a lot of the things that Kraftwerk, tongue in cheek, they did always have a really nice sense of humor and sense of humility to a lot of the things they were saying. But you can look back and actually take quite seriously a lot of the themes that they were putting out there, which thematically hold up extremely well in 2020, which is fascinating and speaks to the intelligence of these guys. And these guys, diving into who they were just a little bit, Rolf Hütter was the main sort of keyboard contributor early on, and eventually became kind of the main songwriter. His fellow co-founder certainly was a heavy contributor to composition early, but as Kraftwerk went on, really starting around this time with Man Machine, Rolf really established himself as sort of the lead songwriter and composition contributor. He was a huge cycling enthusiast, which kind of leads to the eventual Tour de France, project that they did, which was great. But he had a really bad cycling accident in the early 80s and actually went into a brief coma. So thankfully was able to recover and obviously kept, the Kraftwerk project going with some long breaks in between, up until this day. And he's still, fairly active with things. His co-founder is Florian Schneider, who we unfortunately lost just this past April, actually. And he started as a flute player and said he got bored playing the flute and decided to kind of dig into electronics and synthesizers and other instrumentation as he wanted to sort of grow as an artist. So really, Rolf and Florian are really the two guys. He left the group actually in 2009. We did get to see them on their reunion tour with Florian. You and I did in Detroit, which was fantastic. And then unfortunately passed away earlier this year. Now you do have a couple other members on the Man Machine and guys that certainly contributed to the project with some longevity, and that's Karl Bartos, who contributed keys, percussion, some songwriting, and composition support. Even had some songwriting credits for the group. And then Wolfgang Flür, who mostly contributed percussion, but those guys were with the band for many years and certainly deserve to be incorporated into the overall sort of personnel within Man Machine.
Karl Bartos is actually a really good interview. He's been part of some German music documentaries speaking about Kraftwerk and its significance. And he's a nice contributor to those things. But yeah, I mean, even from the very beginning, Ralph and Florian are sort of the guys, and clearly the visionaries of the thing. The other thing you got to mention too about Ralph, he's the vocalist, man. Kraftwerk's vocals are like one of the greatest things in music.
Yeah, no question. I mean, the vocoder usage was something you really hadn't heard. I mean, I believe Kraftwerk sort of introduced that, and that became very prevalent in disco, some of that Giorgio Moroder sound, which we'll hear a little bit here on Man Machine. But yeah, some cool vocal effects and elements that Ralph certainly, contributed heavily. And it's so fun to see them live as they execute vocally. I mean, it's really cool. It's a short album, it's 6 tracks, it's 36 minutes. And Kraftwerk, in their thoughtful, intelligent, sort of uniformed style, were always very efficient. These guys, there wasn't a lot of fat that needed to be chewed off of things. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have long pieces. That doesn't mean that they didn't explore at times experimentally. I mean, it's very few projects in the history of music have been as experimental as Kraftwerk, but they never overdid it for the sake of it. I think they were never indulgent, and they never added tracks or time for the sake of it. So a very efficient album, very much to the point.
That is directly tied to German culture. Mm-hmm. Germany is all about efficiency. Even when you go there, everything makes sense. And if you look at Kraftwerk's music, as artistic as it is and as innovative as it is, everything about it makes sense. Everything's sort of squared off. The imagery is really, rational and efficient. And that's a direct result of being German artists at the time that they were German artists. So it's a great call. It's a good read. I think that has everything to do with them being German.
And a good point by you to tie that in. And as usual, the record was released with both English and German versions. The clips we're going to play today are from the German versions. And that's part of the fun also of revisiting Kraftwerk's catalog is there is a distinct difference. Now, musically, there's not, but in the overall feel and vibe of the English versions versus the German versions. And it is a great time, especially when you're total nerds like us, but it is a great time, I think, to revisit both. And sometimes you're in the mood for the German version and the German albums and the German work. And sometimes you're in the mood for the English stuff. So it's part of the fun, I think, of kind of plowing through these guys' deep catalog. So why don't we plow through, and we're going to do this in English, by the way, but why don't we plow through the Wonder Stories? I know you've got a cool one, Nub, and let's dig into it. All right, Nub, lay it on us. How did you discover and certainly in some cases interact with this band?
Yeah, so I wasn't like 14 years old getting into Kraftwerk, right? Like, I'm not going to mislead anybody. It took a while to understand this band. Now, I think through pop culture, though, you encounter it a little bit. Like earlier, we mentioned Sprockets on Saturday Night Live. I don't know if that theme song is Kraftwerk, but it sure sounds like it. And some of the references and things like that.
I think it is, actually. I think it's something off of Computer World, maybe. But it's that do do do. Yeah. If it's not an exact Kraftwerk song, it sure as hell is heavily inspired by them. It's almost a parody song of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so this sort of like German culture that Kraftwerk helped build and lead certainly came through growing up. You saw it in various places. But in terms of like actually getting into Kraftwerk's music, that was not a thing until, late in college and even post-college. So when I got into Kraftwerk, though, I became obsessively interested in them. I have to give our older brother Scott a shout because he's always been like an electronic music guy. And I've always resisted a lot of electronic music because it's just so repetitive and boring and, thoughtless in my opinion. But
much of it is.
It is. But Kraftwerk, I've quickly realized they make songs and they have an image that is so tied to the music. And it just became obsessively interested in the band. I got all the albums in German and English and just really started diving into them. Well, by 2005, like it wasn't clear that Kraftwerk was going to like ever do anything again. They did the Tour de France soundtracks and I think those were successful. But as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, I reviewed music for several years for a local newspaper. And
AKA best job ever.
Yeah, no question about it, particularly at, 25 years old. And part of my daily routine was to go and refresh Polestar, which was this thing online where you could find out what shows are coming in. And it was big news that Kraftwerk was announcing a US tour. And of course, it was playing the Detroit State Theater. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is the greatest thing ever. Just thinking about going to the show, And so totally on a whim, I got in touch with Astroworks Records, which at this time was their US label. And just, part of my job was to pitch stories and try and get interviews. And dude, I didn't even think Kraftwerk would do an interview. I didn't even know if they even spoke to the public,
Well, they didn't Rolf never did interviews. He purposefully, it was almost like a Neil Peart situation. He just did not enjoy it, didn't want to do it. And Florian very rarely, even in their heyday, would do public appearances or interviews.
It was a true shot in the dark. But you know what? Looking back, I had given this label a few good reviews in the year previous. And so I don't know if they felt like they owed me one or what, but all I did was send a brief email pitch just saying, hey, if there's any opportunity to cover Kraftwerk, I'd love to do it. And they wrote back and they're like, yeah, Ralph is available for an interview after the show on whatever day it was. It was early summer. I think it was June or late May. And I'm just like, holy crap. I instantly became, yeah. I instantly became excited and like kind of nervous, and part of when you review music and spend a lot of time with professional musicians, you're not starstruck, right? Like you kind of see what it's all about. You become more used to spending time with these people. You realize they're just people. They're amazing artists, but they're just human beings like all of us. But this one was different, and so went to the show. The show was incredible. And then after the show was ushered upstairs to the dressing room area. And I'm sitting in this room and just in walks Ralph eating an apple. I always remember that. Because there was just something so pure about it. It was like, oh, he's just enjoying an apple after the show. And we talked for probably 35 minutes. I think we were given 15 minutes. And I think the fact that we talked about some Detroit things and it was just an awesome conversation. He was the sweetest, most gracious, humble dude you've ever met. I mean, he was so kind and so willing to talk about Kraftwerk. There was no hesitation,
That's
to
awesome.
touch on any topics. And it was far and away the highlight of all the interviews that I was lucky enough to be able to do. Was the highlight.
What a highlight. I saw them on that same tour. I was in New York City at the time at the Hammerstein Ballroom. And I did not get to hang out with Rolf after the show. So,
So that's that. So, share with us, what's your Kraftwerk wonder story?
I certainly don't have anything that cool. I also think of Scotty, our older brother, who maybe we should try and have him on the old podcast here at some point. Scotty, if you're listening and you're interested, well, let's do it. That'd be fun. But, sometimes Scotty would get a little elitist musically. Maybe,
just a tad.
Maybe I hope he's not listening now, but no. And sometimes he would, be like, oh, you like them? They're just a version of X or Y or Z, they're the real ones who start. And I'd be like, okay, whatever, Scotty. Right. But I remember you mentioned Sprockets, huge Sprockets fan, probably one of my favorite, like SNL, sort of franchises ever. And just a brilliant, Mike Myers, just so many brilliant angles comedically on so many different cultural things. And this poking fun at this, German avant-garde thing was just so hilarious. And the character Dieter, just, I mean, so effing funny. So I remember at some point talking about sprockets, and I remember Scotty, even this is, we were pretty young still. I remember like saying something about the theme song to Sprockets, or the songs they used to play when they would dance, because there was the trademark, the part on Sprockets. This is the part on Sprockets when we dance and all that. And I remember Scotty being like, that's just really just Kraftwerk, that's Kraftwerk music. They're the ones that really kind of came up with that. And it was like, whenever this would happen, half of me would be like, all right, Scotty, whatever, shut up. But the other half of me would be like, he's probably onto something. I should probably check this out, So, and Kraftwerk, perfect example of that is he started to get really into electronic music. He used to talk about them a lot. And I'm thankful that he did, because it really did help me as well sort of dig into the importance and the influence of this group. And it got to the point where I wanted to have their entire catalog. And I do. Both on vinyl and on CD, I have all those box sets that have all their studio albums in both English and German. And, like I said earlier, both are equally interesting to listen to at times. Sometimes it's hard to pick which one you're in the mood for, but, neither of them end up being a poor choice. But, and then obviously going to see them live in New York City on the tour that you talked about. And then we went a few years later in Detroit and saw them while Florian was still part of the project. At the Masonic Temple Theater, I believe. So, definitely some good experiences in seeing them live, and some even better experiences in really digging into the group and establishing a real appreciation for what they meant to music. Let's get into it here. Let's drop the needle.
Put the needle on the record. 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 When the drum beats go like this.
So again, it was rather difficult to kind of figure out. There's so many great choices of a Kraftwerk album that we could focus on, but we have chosen The Man Machine, 6 tracks, and kicks off with the extremely memorable. You could either call it Die Roboter, or you can call it The Robots.
Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter.
So obviously the German version here, as you can hear, but
it does sound a little bit like he's saying, "We are stinky robots." I will say.
Well, maybe it was, and just playing a joke on all of us. But yeah. We Are the Robots is obviously the main kind of theme of this. And, you mentioned The Model earlier. I think this is the other song that, certainly was released as a single. That's, a very memorable way to kind of start this out, and certainly has become a Kraftwerk classic. Now, what's even more amazing about this as the studio experience of the Robots is the live experience of the Robots, because, part of the live presentation, whenever they perform this song, is they kind of darken the stage. Sometimes they even bring out a curtain and take a minute or two to sort of reset things. And then once they light back up and begin the Robots, you notice that the band members, the human band members, have been replaced by full-on robotic band members that are kind of programmed to move around while this song is being performed in the background. And it is just an incredible part of a Kraftwerk show, just so cool, and obviously fits the track extremely well. But, a great starter, obviously, to this record, and something that certainly is, upbeat, very danceable from the standpoint of kind of the rhythm and the tempo that you're getting, but an extremely memorable Kraftwerk track here.
It is. And, but one of the questions I do have is the sequencing. At the show, if you remember, the 2005 show, which really was kind of the Man Machine show. I mean, all the imagery was geared around Man Machine. I think they played I know they played most of the album. I don't know if they hit the 2 instrumentals. But at the show, they opened with the Man Machine and they closed with the Robots. On the album, the Man Machine's a closing track and the Robots opens it. And I always wondered I wonder what the thinking was in that. Cause to me, the Man Machine is the obvious opener on this album, but they had it as the closer. So
Right.
sequentially, I think it's interesting what they did there, but yeah, the Robots is a very good live song for them. And yeah, it gets into something you touched on earlier, which is, you know, they're starting to really truly create pop songs, you know, songs with a certain amount of catchiness. The Robots, Neon Lights, The Model, these were all singles. And you can see why, because they contain that catchiness to them, but still with that very Kraftwerk Germanic edge to it. And yeah, it's a fun way to kick off this record for sure.
You're right about the track sequencing. It does seem like, now that I think about it, and now that you mention it, that Man Machine may have been kind of the more ideal opener. But you know, it's great bookends nonetheless, however you add it up. But yeah, on their live album that reflected this particular tour, you know, the Man Machine, certainly a memorable opener to that show and to that live disc. So then we get into, with a little bit of vocoder involved, you know, a mostly instrumental experience here, the very pulsing and very up-tempo Space Lab. There's that vocoder, you know, just trademark Kraftwerk. They always used it so well. Such a cool sound, and it's a nice, mostly instrumental piece here coming off of the Robots, which was a bit more pop oriented, and this one's a bit more just sort of a chugging, sort of more repetitive electronic beat and approach that they're taking, with some great elements laid over it.
Yeah, I like this one. I think it's that pulsating thing, you know, that kind of what can't be underrated about Kraftwerk is just how clever they were with rhythms. You know, they would do things in different timings that would work kind of coherently together. And even though they were developing a sense of melody later in their career, and certainly by this album's very melodic, but Space Lab's a good example of just that kind of punchiness, you know, that deep groove that's happening there. And yeah, it's one of my favorite songs on the album for sure. I like the little vocoder vocal. I think it's tasteful. I like that there's very few vocals in the song. And that's one of the things I think Kraftwerk was masterful at. You know, they worked the vocals in very well. It was always tasteful. It was never too much, and it was very infrequently too little. It always seemed to be in that sweet spot, come in at the right time, exit at the right time, and have the right treatments on it. So yeah, Space Lab's a lot of fun.
And then we get into something clearly danceable for those that want to partake, and certainly has a sort of a Moog feel to it here in Metropolis, track 3. Now, a lot of Giorgio Moroder type feel here with kind of the Moog influence. I actually thought that maybe this preceded I Feel Love, which is that classic Donna Summer tune. But actually, I Feel Love came out before this. So I think, though, it works along the same kind of lines of this chugging approach that became very popular with dance music, very popular with disco music around this time. And, you know, certainly Metropolis, I think a nice reflection of that era. Now, it's very Kraftwerk. It's not, you know, you're not going to hear this at the disco. As you got into the further development of new wave and eventually of techno, that really became sort of based on this chugging repetition. And Metropolis captures that well.
This is one of the advantages of the conversation I had with Ralph, which is we all think so much in terms of Kraftwerk as influencers, right? And a lot of my conversation with him was leading with this whole idea of Kraftwerk as an influencer.
Mhm.
He was much more comfortable and apt to talk about Kraftwerk as being influenced.
Hmm.
And he talked a lot about, Juan Atkins and Kevin Saunderson and these Detroit techno founders. I mean, he was very well versed and familiar with what was going on there. And that would be in line with what you're saying, which is that I think Kraftwerk was just as much influenced as they influenced others. And this is very Marauder. I mean, very much so. You could throw this on one of his albums or have Donna Summer singing over it, and it would have been an easy sell. And so I think it's really important that sometimes we tend to overcook the idea of an influencer having influence, but we forget the fact that they were likely very influenced themselves. Kraftwerk continued to grow. They didn't just say, oh, we're influential and that's all we're going to do. They listened. They had wide open ears to what was going on in music, certainly electronic music, and they allowed that to shape them. And I think that Metropolis, really reflects that.
It's a really, really good point. And I think it's probably something that Rolf would appreciate you saying. Sometimes I think you're right. Some of the, these pioneers, which is very deserved in many regards with these guys, obviously. But sometimes that gets overcooked to the point where you forget that these are artists that are influenced themselves and interested themselves in kind of what's going on out there and how it can impact their art. So a great point that I'm sure nobody would appreciate you noting more than the band themselves and Rolf himself. Let's get on to a very memorable piece of this record, and certainly to your earlier point, Nubs, the single that sort of gave this album its commercial life, which was slow developing, but eventually got there. This is Das Model, or as we'd say it here, The Model.
Ich muss sie wiedersehen, ich las, sie hat's geschafft.
3.5 minutes long. I mean, this is a tight number. This is a true album cut here, and one that was certainly developed to be a single, became a single, became a Kraftwerk favorite, and it's just a hell of a song. I often gauge a lot of this type of classic music by, playing it for my son. And a couple of years ago, when he was like 5 years old, he loved The Model. He used to ask for me to play it all the time. And so it even passed the 5-year-old test, which can be an interesting test on unique music and classic music of this type. But, The Model, obviously a great part of the Man Machine.
I love the vocals. I just love the vocals.
Oh, yeah.
Live, and where Ralph puts the hand up to the ear. And,
right.
The thing I love about it is it's super authentic, and Ralph Hütter is not he's not going to sing opera, this is not like a singer, but he's using his voice as this sort of robotic instrument to complement the song. And I think what's cool is that they often masked their voice with vocoders and treatments and all these things. Well, this is just like Ralph's voice straight up, and it just works so well. It's such a deadpan kind of understated element to the song. You got to remember that this came out at a time where radio was playing Steve Perry, Journey, vocals were the forefront, frontman, the whole shot,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Ralph comes along with this just really humble, understated vocal. It's just using his voice as an instrument. It's just super Kraftwerk, and I love that the voice is a little shaky. I just think it's so human, and
Yes.
that's one thing about Kraftwerk is everything they did was so mechanical and robotic, no pun intended, but there's a humanness to The Model.
Yeah.
I think that speaks into what the song is about, and so it's probably their most human song, which made it an obvious single and one that was really important and really successful for the group.
Yeah, I mean, we could literally do an acoustic version of The Model,
Oh, dude, we should. That's a great idea.
But to your point, human element, it's certainly there. And after we get done recording here, why don't we come up with a little bit of an arrangement there? Now, here's one that we probably couldn't and probably shouldn't try an acoustic version of. This is Neon Licht, otherwise known as Neon Lights. It's just so badass. It's actually hard to turn off. I just want to sit here and keep listening to it.
Totally.
But just love that understated minimalist backbeat. You know, it's just so cool. It's just so cool and so simple. And Kraftwerk always had this really incredible knack for being able to take a lot of sometimes swirling, complicated elements and just put them over the simplest foundation or the simplest backbeat that you could ever think of. And Neon Light's a great example of that. Now, this is a long piece. This is, 9 minutes long, which is, pretty much by quite a bit the longest track on the album. And you know what's really cool about it? It's a couple of verses, and then it just kind of enters this, I guess, for lack of a better word, it's a jam. If there was a such thing as an electronic jam band, the last few minutes of Neon Lights is really just that. I mean, these guys are just kind of going after it. So it almost feels like if Kraftwerk was playing at a Fish show, that they spent 5 or 6 minutes here on Neon Lights, just kind of playing it out. And that's part of the charm of it and part of what I really love about this longer piece here.
It's easily my favorite part of this album, easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of it is that jam at the end. And you played the right clip, Maestro. You always do. But that do 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 do. I mean, what a groove, And this is really, to me, where the groove locks in. This is where earlier we kind of speculated, were they into dance? Were they not into dance? Were they, could you dance to it? This song, that last couple minutes of it is so clearly them having fun with the groove. But again, I think the vocals, just neon lights, it's just so good. It's so good, and
that was pretty good. I kind of want to hear you drop a little, I don't know. Can you maybe drop a little Kraftwerk vocal for me? Maybe if let's see, what's that?
I give it a shot.
What Kraftwerk karaoke could have found? Maybe a little Autobahn here. Let's see. Go ahead, drop it.
Fun auf der Autobahn. Fun auf der Autobahn. War uns Lies, Zeit der Stadt. Geht's your shot, dein Farben schnief. I've gone to band with Westerstadt. Banana run, they strutting weird.
Oh,
do you like that?
Boy, I'm glad we did that. That was pretty. I think Verschangenweir was my favorite part.
Yeah, that was a good one.
I'm not even going to do it. I can't. There's no way I top that. There's just no way. So I'm not even going to try.
I know what I'm doing next time we go karaoke, buddy.
Oh yeah, that'll really bring the house down.
Hopefully they have the full 25-minute version.
Let's wrap it up with title track, Die Mensch Machine, or The Man Machine. Like you said on Neon Lights, just a fantastic groove. I mean, the last two tracks of this record just really are, again, no pun intended, just a groove machine. I mean, really getting after it. A great main lick, a great groove. This has been sampled a bunch, a lot of rap artists, and which Kraftwerk has certainly been sampled. I mean, how Coldplay even basically stole a song from them and forgot to credit them and had to eventually. So, you've seen a lot of that influence on composition and certainly influence on sampling. And you've seen that from the Man Machine, but great way to wrap this up.
I do like this version. I will say that the kind of rework they did of it for the 2005 tour, which is captured on that, I think it's called Minimum Maximum.
Yes.
The live album is much better. They brought out some of the vocal a little bit more. They created a little bit more of a song structure and made it make a little more sense than it does on the album. The key is the deep groove, like you said, and then on top of it, you got that. I think the underrated part of the song is that synth pulse that's just doing that ga 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 ga. I mean, it kind of goes through the whole song. Again, rhythmically, there's just so much going on. There's so much going on, but it all works together in this puzzle. And
yeah.
The Man Machine is a good example of that. I think it would have been the ideal opener of the album, but obviously winds it down to a pretty memorable close.
Yeah, and at least they didn't end up with a slouch opening the record. I mean, the Robots, kind of handles it pretty nicely. But you're right. It's a great way to put it. Kraftwerk was able to take a lot of differing elements and kind of piece them together and make it all work. And again, very systematic, very uniformed, very efficient, as we've touched on in that sort of tie into just overall German culture. And certainly while this album put them in a pretty good commercial position and certainly was meant, I think, to be absorbed by a more mainstream audience, you've still got the experimentation. You've still got that blend of simplicity and complication that made Kraftwerk so special. And that wraps up the Man Machine. So, Nubs, did the Man Machine matter?
Here's what I'll tell you. Kraftwerk totally matters. I mean, of all of the artists that we've covered on the podcast, this is maybe the one that matters the most if you really think about it. Will people be rediscovering Kraftwerk in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years? I hope so, and I think so.
I do too.
So Kraftwerk completely matters, and this album is one of their most important. You and I had a conversation a few days ago about what is your favorite Kraftwerk album, and I think for me it's either this or Computer World, both of which I think are their most influential albums as well. I mean, I know Trans Europe Express has some moments, and I mean they all do, right? Autobahn, of course,
yeah.
But this album, if you're taking a group that so clearly matters and will matter for a very long time to come, and an album that captures probably the group at its overall best, when you look at all the things that went into Kraftwerk being, as legendary as they were and hopefully will continue to be, then yeah, I mean, you just got to say, whether the album matters or not, Kraftwerk totally matters. And that's pretty undisputable. What do you think, T?
Yeah, I think it certainly mattered a lot to the group and certainly matters as far as its influence. I think it mattered to the group because you started to see a little bit of this formulation of singles and tighter tracks on the previous album. But Man Machine sort of culminated a lot of the experimentation with something that could be commercial, with something that showed both a couple of kind of longer, more experimental tunes with a couple of tighter singles. It feels to me like them taking all that they had really kind of learned in their first 6 albums and pulling it into something that's to the point, that's very efficient and covers a lot of bases. Computer World is great. That's even, I think, further commercial and even kind of further went along the lines of some of the trends that you were seeing even a couple years later. But I don't think synth pop is what it is without the Man Machine. I don't think sort of new wave and what you started to see come around in the early 80s is what it is without Man Machine. And I don't think Computer World is the album that it was without Man Machine sort of preceding it and kind of establishing this direction. Because I do think it was a little bit of a pivot point for the band in kind of taking them in a direction that they really hadn't fully kind of dove into previously. So yeah, I think this one matters a lot, both for the longevity of the band and for kind of its impact on this evolution of electronic and techno and dance music going forward. All right. Well, let's do the final cut. Is it on the turntable? Is it in the collection? Is it collecting dust? Or is it in the for sale bin? What do you got, Nub?
Yeah, you put Kraftwerk in the for sale bin and bad things are going to happen to you.
Yeah, that's a bad omen, I think.
Yeah, that's not a good move. So, 2 weeks ago, this album would have been collecting dust, but now I'm just going to upgrade it to in the collection. So it took a little bit of rediscovery. So, full transparency, as we always are with our audience, we're transparent people, right? I wasn't listening to this frequently, and it had been a while since I listened to all 6 tracks in sequence. Now that I did, I think it'll make, more regular rotations. But like we touched on earlier, it's in the collection because everyone should own this. Everyone should own a Kraftwerk album. If that's not like federal law, let's make it one, right? And if you're going to, there's not that many choices, and this probably is the one. So in the collection for me, but that's an upgrade from, again, T, you're always bringing the good ideas to the table, right, with the podcast. So you're able to, re-inspire me to take this out of the plastic and play it again. And that it's led to an upgrade. So we're going from collecting dust to in the collection. What is it for you, T?
I'm going to put it on the turntable because I think it's the definitive Kraftwerk album. As you get later in their catalog, things do get pretty heavily melodic and heavily commercial, and that's great. I mean, I love that stuff. If you precede Man Machine, it was a little bit more crowdy, a little bit more experimental and some of those things. And I feel like this was the middle point where they kind of brought it together. So if you sort of bookend their career and move toward the middle, I think Man Machine is the one that really captures the band in its complete essence. I like that it's tight. I like that it's a 36-minute listen. You don't have to take half a day to sort of dig into it and get through it. The singles are great. The shorter songs, with the robots and the model. I mean, those are very memorable Kraftwerk tunes. But then you get into Neon Lights and Metropolis, and I mean, these are just very creative, very creative. And to your point, I think you made a good one. The band having a good time. You can hear the group kind of having fun in a lot of different points of this record. You can tell it's very authentic. There's an effort to be a little bit commercial and a little bit mainstream, but it's not overdone. There's an effort to kind of stick to their original roots, but that's not overdone. I just think it's a very balanced Kraftwerk record, and one that is not a terribly difficult choice for me. If you had to pick one out of their entire catalog, I'm going with the Man Machine. All right. Well, what a cool, unique group and record to kind of plow through here. Why don't we cool it down a little bit here as we tap into our pal Dolores here with a little
In your head.
Nub, what do you got?
Let's just go ahead and kick off In Your Head for me with a little tune called Pretty Vacant,
Oh, okay.
coming off an album called Never Mind the Bullocks by, of course, the Sex Pistols.
Great jam. Great jam.
Oh, the opening. So
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
So good. Next, actually, an opening track, sung by a kind of lesser known band from the 2000s called the Juliana Theory. And it's This Is a Love Song for the Loveless. It's an opening from an album called Deadbeat Sweetheart. One of those should have been, could have been bands and should have been, could have been albums, but a killer jam. And then a good 80s song, the Thompson Twins with Lay Your Hands on Me.
Yeah.
Thompson Twins with 2 or 3 of the better songs of the 80s. Hold Me
They're
Now.
great. Oh, yeah. They're
but
great.
Lay Your Hands on Me, I think is.
I mean, Doctor's a hell of a song.
Yeah, it's really good.
They were really, really good. I mean, I think it was just that one album that captured most of those hits, but yeah, they were a great group.
And probably wouldn't sound that way without Kraftwerk, right? So there you
Indeed.
See, what is in your head?
Well, I kind of made fun of you for going in the sort of episode genre direction and on the round and round. But, I kind of did the same thing here on In Your Head, I must say. So I'm going to start off with Gary Newman, I know a favorite of yours. And this is his song Respect, which was kind of a little bit later era Newman. But the live version off of his Skin Mechanic live record, I think is one of his best live tracks. Total jam, real driving song there from Newman, and one that certainly one of my Newman favorites.
Speaking of other guys that I met and interviewed, awesome interview, Gary Newman. What a perspective he has on his own career.
Okay, now you're just rubbing it in. Okay, shut the hell up. All right, we get it. Okay,
all right.
No, that's cool. The second is a Erasure, and this is Hallowed Ground, which is off the Innocents. It's a little bit of an album cut for them, but a definite favorite by many, big Erasure fans, of which I am certainly one. So Hallowed Ground, a great tune by those guys. And then the third, another band that was part of this synth pop scene that had to be heavily influenced by Kraftwerk, and that's Depeche Mode. This is the song Strange Love. It's a bit of a dark song, a clear celebration of masochism, but very catchy, upbeat, great tune. I think this is one of those very kind of part of this new wave synth era that captured it well. Some very cool layers and elements on Strange Love. Also, obviously, part of a great album from Depeche Mode, who I'm also a large fan of. All right, Nub. Well, hey, that's a wrap on episode 21 here. A lot of fun talking about these German fellas with you.
Yeah, hopefully some people listening go and I don't know, maybe purchase. Do people still purchase music? I don't know, but go out and check it out. I was actually surprised to see Kraftwerk's catalog is on like Amazon Music and stuff. It just didn't seem right to me. But it is on there, so people should check it out for sure.
It sure is. Check it out, both the English and German versions. And check us out as well. We're tweeting away at the number 2_twins_album. So follow us. Let us know if there's an album you'd like for us to talk about. We'd be more than happy to take those requests. And we've actually done a couple episode requests. And listen, aside from that, just stay safe out there and be good to each other. All right. I think we can all agree to that. And we will see you for episode 22 as we hit you up next time here on Two Twins and an Album.
Two twins.
Well, that's about it. That's all we have. I hope it wasn't too disappointing. We will see you on tour. Until then, take it easy.